Hello and welcome to part 2 of Themes in Beloved. We left off on femininity, we picked up with masculinity. So if I was going to write an essay on masculinity, I might think about these things. I might talk about the metal imagery associated with men versus the natural imagery that is often associated with women in the novel but is sometimes applied to men. I might talk about that rape scene of the chain gang. I might talk about whether Paul D is threatened by Seth's strength. I might think about the spatial relegation that he suffers kind of beyond 124. So he feels unwelcome, he walks through that red light, doesn't he, at the beginning, and then he eventually finds himself in the outhouse, and he eventually finds himself with nowhere to go, and how 124 seems to be a really female space. As I said, with femininity, I might talk about male slave labour versus female slave labour, and how female slave labour was a little bit more domestic, and masculine slave labour seems to be much more kind of physically grueling, and perhaps even the punishments are a little worse. So the bit in the mouth, for example, the collar, the chain gun. Is there perhaps less individuality for men in this novel, or for male slaves? Thinking about how there are many Pauls, Sweet Hope, for example. Okay, so another theme that you might want to discuss is the idea of memory. So there are two really important words that Toni Morrison kind of invents, if you will, in this novel to do with memory. So she calls rememory, where the past comes back to the present, and she refers to disremembering, where Seth kind of willfully suppresses the past. So ideas of the past and trauma are really key in Beloved, and these are the things that I might want to think about in an essay on that. So I might talk about how Morrison writes with the voices of silenced people, and how she recuperates a history that had been either forgotten, like Seth's repressed memories, or silenced, like the bit that's used to stop Paul D from speaking. I might talk about Seth's tree and how that's a constant reminder of her trauma. It's always behind her, it's like the past that she carries with her into the present, and at the beginning, it's between her and Paul D, and they have to kind of learn to overcome it. I might talk about the character of Beloved and how she embodies the past invading the present. I might talk about how her effect on Seth is that she seems to corrupt her sense of time. So she regresses into childhood. She gives up her job. She spends all her savings on clothes. She plants things kind of out of season. She's just totally knocked off kilter, isn't she, by the arrival of Beloved. So Seth nearly loses her identity and her life through her obsession with this kind of lost child or the past or guilt, suggesting that focusing on the past can be all-consuming and very destructive. So if we think of that battle in part 3, Beloved is absolutely winning, isn't she? She's grown stronger and bigger, and Seth is totally emaciated by it. Two key quotes on this theme. For Seth, the future was a matter of keeping the past at bay. So her mode of survival of getting through the day to the next is by forgetting the past. And then right at the end, we have this idea that perhaps they can let go of the past together and become forward-looking people. So Paul D says to Seth, me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow. And they kind of build that together, don't they? I might talk about the epilogue, how it finally kind of controls, I suppose, that narrative voice by keeping it in the past tense, and it seems to achieve some degree of temporal distance for all it is quite an open ending. And I might just talk about how it's that healing love from Paul D, from Denver, and actually that whole Black community that Seth learns to let go of a terrible history that defined her. So the community eventually forgive her, Denver eventually forgives her, and Paul D kind of gets past it after reading the newspaper article and deciding to leave. Everybody comes back to her, and she eventually kind of forgives herself when Beloved disappears. So she discovers that she can define herself through the future that she creates with this family. Okay, so freedom and healing is the last big theme, I believe, in this novel, and these are the things that I might focus on if my essay was on that. So I might talk about the struggles of freedom and how just because you have left the South and you've come to the free North doesn't necessarily mean that it's an easy ride. How Seth doesn't know what to do to claim her freedom. How even though she's free, she's still quite shunned and isolated and not really accepted in Cincinnati because of what slavery in her past has kind of forced her into. I might talk about how Baby Suggs is a really redemptive character and how she seems to heal people and remind them of their human and sensual attributes that were lost in slavery. I might talk about the role the community plays in healing. I might talk about Paul D's tobacco tin and how eventually he manages to open his heart. I might talk about the motif of water with this idea of healing and how it can cleanse you. So water is really important for images of kind of rebirth and cleansing, and it's a very kind of Christian motif, isn't it? I might talk about Seth's tree. So obviously there's a scar that has healed, and how far that scar suggests that she can move on. Is the fact that it's on her back and she can kind of turn her back on it a hopeful message, or is the fact that she carries it on her back actually a kind of burdensome, problematic issue? I would talk about the front door of 124 and how Baby Suggs decides she's not going to have a back door, and how she has the freedom to decide that as a freed woman. But I might also think about maybe the fact that there's not a lot of privacy there. And we've had Stampede saying that because he has lived through so much as a slave, that now he believes that certain things are kind of due to him, I suppose, and he expects to be able to walk through anybody's front door, and he struggles with that with 124 when Beloved materializes. So the front door, quite an ambiguous threshold in this novel. I would talk definitely about the exorcism of Beloved and how she finally disappears and she's gone and she's forgotten by the end of the novel. I think that's a big symbol of healing, isn't it? And how maybe Seth can get beyond her past and the guilt. And finally, I would talk about that very final scene between Seth and Paul D and how they talk of tomorrow. I just want to refer you back to this slide then that we have seen in the previous lesson, which is all about freedom. So some quotes here from Morrison in Beloved, which are all about freedom that you might find useful were you to write an essay on it. And here are some links to further reading from SparkNotes and CliffsNotes, as always. Very accessible, really very interesting, and I would highly recommend. But also, as I say, don't forget about JSTOR. Make use of that while we've got it. Good luck.